Hi everyone, welcome to the May Tech Talk on SurePath. I'm John Diamond, and along with me is my colleague Pete Bars. We're both Intuity solution architects from the United States-based team. Today, Pete and I will present the key areas for you to understand to maximize your use of the new SurePath. A few housekeeping items before we get into today's content. The call is on mute mode to eliminate any outside noise. However, feel free to ask questions at any time via the chat panel. We'll make sure to have time at the end to take questions that have been posted. As usual, we will be using the latest version of Intuity Network Analytics, ENA 18, for our demonstration purposes. All of the features we're discussing today are found in ENA 18. So, let's get started. It's important to understand that the aspects of SurePath that we're going to be focusing on today are new in ENA 18. There are now two forms of SurePath logic available within ENA 18. And they allow for paths to be discovered and monitored using two entirely different approaches. Both are relevant, but they do have different use cases and different characteristics. The version of technology available prior to version 18 included what we are now calling agentless path discovery. On this slide, you can see it referred to as the original SurePath. Now, its key characteristics are that it is able to discover a path made up of both layer 2 and layer 3 hops. It uses an agentless technique, which is SNMP based, and it is intended for use within a network. And that network is going to be monitored. So within a monitored network, that the devices in the path are already under management from ENA, you're going to be able to discover a path between two nominated nodes that are either nodes under management or nodes directly connected to managed items. In ENA 18, we have a new form of technology, which is agent-based. And this allows for paths to be discovered. They are layer 3 paths, and it allows for the paths to be discovered not only inside a managed network, but also outside across the internet out to the cloud. And there are different characteristics that I'm going to be focusing on, and Pete is then going to take over and give you some demonstrations. I'd like to just review a few typical types of use cases that the various different technologies here can help you address. Let's take the first one, network path analysis of applications. Where you have an application within your own managed network, so it's running on a server that you are hosting, then you can use either technique, either the agent-based or the agentless, to trace a path from a client to that server. If you are using the agent-based technique, you're going to need an agent at the point where the client is recognized to be. And we'll talk about installing that agent when Pete takes over. If you're using the agentless approach, then you'll get both layer 2 and layer 3 hops. The agent-based will show you the layer 3 hops, but with the agent-based, an important point is that you're going to be getting timing information, the round-trip latency information from every hop on the route, including the far end. If you are responsible for your organization's cloud or SaaS type resources, where you've got cloud applications being used by your organization, then a significant portion of the network path between your users and that application service are going to be outside the scope of your management. You're not going to be managing individual nodes on the internet. You don't have access to that information. So that is a use case that is particularly important, and that is relevant to the new agent-based monitoring. And that's the fact that it doesn't need the devices in the path to be under management is the critical differentiator there. One of the key aspects that this technology brings to the table, particularly the agent-based technology, is that you're going to be able to look at poor performance, particularly where you've got increased latency for a period of time, and review how that corresponds to path changes, particular problem nodes on the path between the client and the server, and how we show that within the product. Another area where a use case would be particularly relevant here is when you are planning to migrate on-premise applications, which are hosted locally, out to being hosted on the cloud. There's going to be a latency change when you do that, inevitably. Almost certainly, the client-to-server latencies are going to increase. Depending on the architecture and the cloud vendor, it will either be more or less. Some applications can take that in their stride without much, if any, impact on the end users. Other applications which were not designed with higher latencies in mind may be severely impacted. And so understanding what likely latency increase you're going to be getting is worth attempting before you make a significant migration. So doing some upfront work with that to assess the latency changes is going to be important. And finally, just a quick thought about disaster recovery plans, particularly where you've got failover situations on the network that you would like to audit before you actually run into problems with a real failure. Auditing where the traffic goes during a failover scenario, and also auditing what happens when the circuits come back online, the primary circuits come back online to prove that the traffic goes back to a primary route is another use. In fact, both the agent-based and agentless approaches are valid in that case. Before I hand over to Pete, I just want to show you quickly what the two different styles of path tracing look like. If we take a look at the original, this is the agentless approach. I'm going to show you a path. And here, all of these individual hops are discovered via SNMP approaches. And each one of these, I can show you the individual ports on each device that are connected. And it can also assess what the spare capacity is because it knows what the utilization and the line speeds of each of these nodes or these links are, because everything here is under management. These are a combination of layer 2 and layer 3 hops, but you won't notice any timing information because the agentless approach does not evaluate round-trip timing. Down at the bottom here, this indicates the historic success or failure of the path tracing from one end to the other. It doesn't indicate any form of timing. Incidentally, when you do navigate within the SurePath dashboard to an individual path, to get back to the SurePath dashboard, just use the browser back button. So here's the complete list of paths. If I were to look at this path out to Google, this is being monitored using the new agent-based approach. If I were to zoom in here, here's an agent, and you'll see every hop on the path, and you'll see here that this is showing a multi-path route, which is taking different routes each time, and this is a composite of a multi-path route. Then each node has a round-trip timing indication, including the far end nodes. And so we've got timing here. And if we look along the bottom here with the history of timing, then you'll see that there is timing information included in the history for route tracing that's happened in the past. So with that said, I'm going to pass control over to Pete, and Pete's going to take you through in a lot more detail.
All right, thanks, JD. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Let's talk, we'll continue from what JD was mentioning as far as looking at the paths, and let's talk about some examples. We're going to focus on the new agent methodology for SurePath, and we're going to talk about how to set it up, how do I know that it's set up on the system, how do I actually create some paths, and how can I look at the paths to actually understand the behavior and any issues that might be going on with that application. What we'll start out with is this is just a custom dashboard that I've got set up in my system. This is leveraging the same information that you saw on the previous screens that JD has shown. I just created a custom dashboard layout that allows me to see all my paths that I'm monitoring. I've got combinations of agentless and agent-based paths, and I could just selectively pick the paths. I've got this one, I'm going just to the Intuiti website, and I can automatically just select these paths and highlight the path that I want to be able to take a look at. So this is just another way to look at it. Again, like other components in Intuiti, you can leverage those components, build custom dashboards around those to be able to tell the story that you want to be able to focus on. Now within the path discovery, and I'll show this again later in the demo, but you'll see that we're focusing on latency. We're looking at latency from a beginning point, and in my case, this is my Intuiti server. I have an agent on my Intuiti server. Every Intuiti server where you've got SurePath configured will have an agent, and I'll talk about the mechanics of setting that up and configuring it in a minute as well. But in this case, my path starts at the Intuiti server and works its way out all the way to the Intuiti website. So I'm looking hop by hop. I'm looking at latency across that multi-pathed layer 3 path all the way over to Intuiti.com. So again, I'm looking at each one of the paths. I can look at historical paths. I've actually got one here that had some degraded components, so I can selectively look at that as well. Now, before we go any further in setting up paths and looking at some of the different ways to visualize and identify some of the the incidents and errors that might be taking place across this path, let's talk a little bit about configuration of the system to set the paths up. So the first step, in order to use SurePath, your first step is to make sure that SurePath is enabled. So when you run configure, you'll see a new selection in Intuiti 18 that says, do you want to enable or disable SurePath? So make sure when you run configure on your systems that you've enabled SurePath. At that point, if you take a look at the administration menu, so if you go under the main menu, go under administration, you're going to see a new section called SurePath administration. Now, as I said, every Intuiti server's got an agent built into the system. But what you want to make sure to do, even though it's built into the system, you want to make sure to configure the agent. So you want to tell the system that I've got an agent, I want to configure that by name so that I can use that as I set up a path. And the way to do that is just select the agents menu right here. So if I take a look at that, you'll see that I've got other agents installed as well. But I've got the agent that I've set up on my lab server right here. This is my Intuiti server 12.3. And all I did was go in, this was blank originally. I went in and created an agent. I gave it a name. I gave it the IP address of my server. It's using port 5590, so just leave this as the default. If you're using Intuiti zones, you can leverage that as well and then just add a description. Basically, these selections hit done, and that will actually configure the running agent that's sitting on your system already. Now, one of the questions that we had from customers is, how do I know that the Intuiti agent is actually running on my server? The way to do that is to take a look at the system information. Go to your Intuiti server and just take a look at the processes. You'll see if the Intuiti agent is configured, if you enabled SurePath at configure time, you'll actually see this running, and you'll see this in an up state. So that's the easiest way to take a look at the fact that, yes, I've got the Intuity SurePath configured, and I've got an agent actually configured into the system. So I've actually configured an agent. We'll go back to that menu. I've configured an agent, and I'm ready to go. I can actually start creating paths leveraging this agent. Now, what if you want to create path sources, maybe from places that are not your Intuity server? So again, because Intuity SurePath is a agent-based technology, that agent software is available to you in order to install on various parts of your network. So you can actually create an agent and install it on another server. So if I selected that agent software link, it'd actually take you to just the download packages. So we include a Windows and a Linux software set that you can just download and install. It's a lightweight install it on a server at a remote location. I work with a number of customers who are installing these at some of their major sites across the globe. So whether or not you're in Brazil and you've got remote office sites and you want to be able to look at access from a remote site to a specific application set and actually identify problems with that level of access to that cloud application, you can actually install the software at your various sites. So I've actually done that. So if I go back to this window and let's take a look at, I'll go back into administration, and we'll take a look at the agents that I've configured. You'll see that I've actually got 2 additional agents, one down in Brazil and one in my lab. They're actually using hosts these are different servers that are sitting across my network. So I've actually got the capability to look at something like Office 365 from one location, from another location, and from a third location. So as many agents as I've got, I can actually look at a path to that application from the perspective of those points in my network. So I've got all of my agents set up and running. I've actually got a number of paths set up on my system. So let's take a look at setting up a path. So this is that same list that JD had shown you earlier. So this is one of our systems. We've got a number of paths set up. We've got the source of that path. So in the case where this is an agent-based path, this is the agentless technology here. This is an agent-based path. I can actually identify the source Intuity server or source SurePath agent that I want to be able to use. So there's a couple different ways that I can actually set up and create a path. One is you'll see the menu creation, the create a path menu button right here, or I can actually go under the path dashlet menu right here and create a path. Now I can remove paths. I can edit my existing paths from here as well. If I want to edit a path, that I've already created, I can go in and do an edit on that as well. Now, one thing that you'll note too is, and I find this in a number of cases where, especially if I want to create an Outlook 365 path that is sourced from Brazil or from my lab or from London or a different office that you may have, just duplicate the path, change the source. So if I duplicate this path, I can change the source that I'm starting from, and I'm done. It's very easy to do. So let's actually create a path, and we'll talk about the various pieces that you want to pay attention to when you're setting this up. The first one is, do I want to use the agent or not? Obviously, the original SurePath agentless-based technology is there if I turn this off. By default, the agent is on. So let's just set up a path. I'm just going to call this test as an example. I can put a description in here. I'm going to put a destination in here, and I'm just going to point this to the Intuity website. This can be any destination. I've had customers that one of my colleagues was working with that are looking at pointing this to a DNS server or to a SIP server or to an internal on-premise application. So it's whatever destination that you want to be able to get to, and the destination port. So in my case, I'm going to use 443 because this is a web application. But again, if you're using a different type of application that's using a different TCP port, just add that port in here. Now here with the agent, I'm going to define the agent that I want to be able to use. On this server, we've only got one agent, and that's the agent that's sitting on the Intuity server. In my case, where I showed you earlier, you'd actually see a list of 3 servers that you can pick from. I'm going to hit done here, and this is now going to take me into the threshold settings. Now, actually, before I get there, let's talk a little bit about frequency. By default, paths can actually retest themselves every 5 minutes. I can change that. So if I want to do something that's less frequent, I can certainly change this from 5 minutes up to daily. By default, it's 5 minutes. 5 minutes is not a bad method to look at, especially if you're paying attention to a critical web application. Now, in terms of latency, again, we look at latency from the source to your destination. This is in terms of milliseconds. I'm going to set this at 25 milliseconds. And then I'm going to pay attention to the batch threshold percentage. Now, the batch, what does that mean? The batch threshold is the overall average threshold, overall latency that it takes to get to the endpoint. So every 5 minutes, we run a batch of paths. So we generate, by default, 5 paths. Actually, let me just make sure that that's 5 paths. Yep, this is the number of paths that I'm running every 5 minutes. And what I want to look at is what percentage of those paths in a batch exceed my latency. So if I have 3 of the 5 paths that exceed 25%, I'm going to be looking at 60% as a batch threshold. So in my case here, if I put this at 40%, I need to have at least 40% of my batch being below the latency threshold individually. So this is actually going to be used to generate an alert. So again, if you have one path that actually goes above latency, it's probably okay. But if I have a whole bunch of them that are going above latency, then this is how I wanted to detect that. This is actually going to generate a high path latency alert. If I take a look at the advanced settings, again, by default, I can run 5 trace routes. This is using the TCP trace route methodology. I'm going to run 5 of them every 5 minutes. This is a good number to leave. You can certainly change it if you need to, but 5 is a good number as a default. I can also change the source IP address. So if my server has got multiple IP addresses, that might actually have routing changes, where if I go one IP, I've got a different route that it's going to take. A different IP address might take an external route or a different route. I can actually choose the IP address on my server that I want to be able to source from. Or if I don't care, I just leave it at any IP. So once I've actually got these set up, I just hit done. And then it's going to tell me that I don't have any license credits available. So in my lab, I've actually got this highly restricted. So this is actually going to finish. It's going to generate a path. Now what you'll see is there will be a blue icon for your new path. It's going to take a number of minutes, a number of cycles in order to actually do the first path. So don't expect it to go out and actually discover the path instantaneously. Now give it 15, 20 minutes for it to actually get set up in the system and actually start generating information. Now I've got the path set up. I'm actually looking at a history of paths. Let's take a look at an example of a path that I've got in the system where I've been running this on a regular basis. I can actually, again, look at the history. I can see some high latency. I can see paths that have been successful, and I've got a lot of paths that are actually going just over latency measurement. This is my path. I'm actually looking through my service provider network, starting from my Intuity server here. You can see hop by hop latency. You can actually see which node, and these are service provider nodes, where I actually exceeded the latency on a given TCP trace route. So again, I'm running 5 trace routes per 5 minutes, which is why you see a lot of multipathing going on here. Overall, I'm looking at 26 milliseconds, and I've just set my latency threshold to below this. I think I set it at 25 in order to generate alerts. But this is actually not too bad. I've got one case where it took, it's all about 25 milliseconds. I've actually worked with customers where we've seen Some nodes respond, 4 times latency compared to other nodes. And these are certainly indicative of something that might be an application problem that customers might be, reporting to you. But the path itself, again, you can see a lot of information in here. Now, from my perspective, if I'm looking at this, I care a lot about my systems. So if I'm actually pointing this to my cloud, I care about, the destination on the far right, and I care about the source as it egresses my network. I'm not as concerned because I can't control what the service providers are doing here. So I'm not concerned as much about, the nodes themselves in the picture. I do care that I have a service provider problem here, something that I might want to report to. But from a visualization standpoint, I can actually hide this. So if you go under the dashboard menu for the SurePath dashboard, you can actually go in and collapse the internet nodes. So again, this is all pretty small. So let's take this and turn it around. Let's turn it 90 degrees to actually show the vertical layout as well. So this is a better picture because this actually shows me as I'm egressing my network, getting into the service provider network, it's showing me that I do have some high latency in the service provider space, but I also have some high latency across the nodes where I've got, resilient nodes for my, web destination. So Office 365 has certainly got a lot of servers that it can respond from. A number of these are actually giving me a little bit of latency. So the dashboard menu allows me to actually do some of that level of selection. Now, what if I want to take a look at this from a little bit different angle? JD had mentioned in the original SurePath, there's the capability to detect, path changes. And, one of the things that we have done historically is look at deviations in a path. Let's actually change this back to the horizontal layout. I want to just show you some of what I'm talking about. So in the original SurePath, we would actually detect hop by hop across a layer 2 and layer 3 network and actually identify where there are deviations. The path used to go this way, now it's going this way. We've changed this in the current version of SurePath, where we actually are now including a required and a blacklist setting. So you have the capability to identify a preferred route going out of your network. So especially if you control this, this might be redundant routers from your standpoint, or might be a backup connection going out of a router at a remote site to one service provider with a primary going out to another service provider. One of the things that I can do is if this was the primary, all I need to do is make this a required node. So I've just added this to the required list. In the case that I ever see a path going out of my network that is taking a route that is not including 50.28.60.2, it's going to generate an alert. So this is another way to look for path deviation. It'll actually give you an incident that's called a path deviation. So required and blacklist capabilities, I can just do that by selecting the node itself. And this can be a service provider node. I'm not managing this node at all. Or I can go into the list to take a look at what are the nodes that are part of my required or basically whitelist, blacklist settings. And this is a path-by-path node or a path-by-path setting. I've got this one as required. I can also just as easily put this on a blacklist, where if I ever see 60.2, generate an alert, because that means my path is taking a different route, and that might indicate that that route is less preferred, maybe doesn't have the bandwidth, and you might have customers that are going to complain about application access or some performance, degraded performance to that application. So I think those are the areas that I wanted to cover, looking specifically at the setting up a path, setting up the configuration of the system, adding agents to be able to initiate paths from various parts of your network. Again, if I want to look at the history, I can very easily scan across the history. If I want to take a look at a specific node, all I have to do is select that node, and the node will actually identify where I've got indications of high latency over time. So both I can look at the path to look at the historic path to see if I've got latency, and I can look at specific nodes to see if those nodes have got a history of latency issues. Now, how can I use paths? So again, SurePath is going to generate an incident. So I've got a high path latency incident here, just like any other event and incident in Intuity. These can be forwarded into ticketing systems. They can be emailed. I'm correlating 21 occurrences of path latency for my Outlook 365 source, into one line. So I'm doing noise reduction, and I can leverage that information. But in addition to that, I can use paths to make custom dashboards, similar to the dashboard that I've shown you here. I can also take paths and integrate them into the Google map. So the new geographic map in Intuity 18. So this is a Google Map integration, a Google Map custom dashboard that I've got set up. I'm actually leveraging 3 of my locations. Again, these are 3 views that are sitting underneath my by office view. They've each got their own address set up. So my New York view's got a New York address, so they're actually displaying on the geographic map. Now I've tuned this map to actually tell me a story about path latency issues. So I've actually indicated in the dashboard settings that the markers for each one of my locations should be green and only change color in the case of a path issue. So what you can see here is that, Tampa's okay. I've got some issues going on in Burbank and Tampa, so I probably got some device-based performance issues. I might actually have an outage. But my path from Burbank to something like Office 365 or one of my web applications is just fine. The only one I should pay attention to is this one because it's colored red. So I've selected this. So if I take a look at Tampa, there's really nothing going on there. Again, if I take a look at New York, I've actually seen that same path high latency incident. And I'm actually showing all the paths that I've actually got set up in that region. So these paths are actually included in the view, and they're part of role-based access. You can do access control around these as well. But I can select this path and actually show that path similarly to what we saw in the standard SurePath dashboards. So again, paths can be included in views. They can be included in leverage the geographic maps, and they can also be included in services. So just like any other component, I've got a New York office service definition. You can see that I've got a degraded level of service in New York. Well, let's take a look and see what that is. The reason I'm degraded is because I've got a problem with access to Outlook. Again, if I select Outlook 365, this will take me to the path dashboard, and I can investigate that. From an incident perspective, I'm leveraging a service problem incident here too. So the path is actually degraded. It's generating a path latency issue, but because I've got that path included in a service definition, I've actually got a service-based problem incident. If I wanted to take a look at this, I can drill into it. Again, if I want to take a look at the summary and find out what's actually causing that, just look at the summary and you can see that it's being caused by the path. So service-based incidents, the path-based incidents based on latency and availability of the path and deviation in the path. I think with that, I'll turn it over to JD and Pat, and we'll see if we've got any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Pete. And I think I'd like to just reiterate something that came out of what Pete's just been showing, and that is, why would you be particularly concerned about where in the path a high latency was being introduced? Well, if I were having problems, and I, for example, were to have one of my users complaining of high or intermittent performance problems, and I had located the time on a particular path that was showing up, by taking a look at the path, the first question I'm going to want to ask after confirming that there really is a problem is, whose problem is it? In other words, is it my problem? In other words, it's on my network. Is it the far-end service provider's problem? or is it somewhere in the middle, in other words, the internet? Now, if it's my problem, I've already highlighted the device at which the high latency was being introduced. I've got a good fighting chance now of being able to dig in and deal with it. If the problem is definitely at the far end, in the service provider's network at the far end, then I'm paying them good money. I've got the right to call them up and discuss it with them, armed with the knowledge of exactly where I'm detecting the problem. On the other hand, if the problem is in the middle of the internet, well, let's face it, odds are you're probably not going to be able to do anything about it. It'll probably just sort itself out. But the important thing there is I'm not going to waste my time chasing a ghost in my own network, and I'm not going to embarrass myself by calling up the service provider complaining about a problem that is not, after all, in their network. So it's a critical point. How do you talk to the right people, get the right resources on the problem, if at all, given the knowledge of where the problem is? With that said, I think it's time for looking at some questions. Pat, do we have any questions?
Yes, JD, we have a couple. And the first one is, can I have a customer install an agent on a machine that is not managed by Intuity? The agent would be co-located with an application in a hosted environment, but as an Intuity admin, do not have management rights in that hosted environment.
Okay, the answer is a conditional yes. The requirement for having the agent located anywhere is that an ENA server that you have within your ENA configuration is going to be able to reach it by default on TCP port 5590 in order to gather information from it and to configure it. Provided that you can establish that connection, then that agent can legitimately be located out there and be used. It's also worth me just pointing out that from an ENA licensing standpoint, we do not license each instance of the agent. You can deploy as many agents as you want, wherever you want, provided that you've got a route to them and you can reach them on that TCP port. The licensing comes down per monitored path, and it's the number of paths that are simultaneously being monitored that controls the number of SurePath licenses that will be required. Pat, do we have anything else?
Yep. How is SurePath licensed? Is it based on the number of paths or number of agents?
It is based upon the number of paths. It is not based upon the number of agents. So it's the number of paths that are being simultaneously monitored. So if you have 2 agents and you've got 5 paths being monitored from one and 15 paths being monitored from the other agent, then that would require a total of 20 SurePath licenses in order to sustain that.
I'm currently using ENA 17. And is there a charge for SurePath?
Yes, there is. It's still the per path charge. Now, bear in mind that in version 17, that supported agentless path tracing only. It did not include the agent. 17 does not support the agent. If you want to use the agent-based path tracing, and the agent base, of course, as we've shown you, includes the latency monitoring. It also includes the ability to handle multipath, which is typical of internet communication, and it also is steered by the TCP port that you provide so that you can evaluate paths through a policy-controlled routed network where paths are different for different TCP ports. Then all of that requires the agent-based technology, which requires version 18. But both ENA 17 and ENA 18 require a SurePath path license per monitored path.
Okay, thanks, JD. And then how do we identify which ISP if one device is having multiple ISP links connected to it?
Okay, basically, at this point, the paths which are displayed, the composite of all of the routes being taken from the agent out to the destination. And as you saw from some of the paths that Pete was showing you, if you look very carefully, some of those paths had multiple endpoints because the host name that you provide may resolve to multiple IPs. In fact, the Outlook at Office365.com resolves to about 15 different IPs. So if you look across there, it may end up traveling across multiple service providers. So certainly under the more simple situation where you've got two service providers, one of whom is treated as your primary and one is your backup or secondary, what you may want to do is to put a blacklist notation for the IP address of the entry point into your secondary service provider. And as Pete's showing you at the moment, that can also be done just interactively by right-clicking the node if you've already got it in the path. If it's not already in a displayed path, you can just go to the blacklist dialog there and enter the IP explicitly. But that gives you the ability to generate a warning event and incident if it is found that any of your traffic is going across your secondary or backup service provider. So that's a very good use for that particular aspect of the path tracing. So one way or another, you can see which service providers your traffic is traveling over and get proactive warnings if it's going over a service provider that you don't want it to. What you could also do is put a required notation there on your primary path. And so if you've got multiple service providers, one of whom is considered your primary, you could get a warning if you're deviating and not using the primary, all within the scope of what you can do.
Okay, thanks, JD. And then does version 18 support installation on Red Hat 6?
The answer is no. We no longer certify Red Hat 6 for version 18. Red Hat 6 is now deprecated. Red Hat 6, if you actually were to, for example, go up to Azure or AWS, you're not going to be able to get a Red Hat 6 installation any longer. It's considered too old. So it's somewhat antiquated. It's time to upgrade.
And then I see a few unknown X devices. Are those devices which we could not identify?
The unknown are actually almost fake hop in the route. The route tracing is based upon increasing the time to live, or TTL parameter, within each of the test packets that get sent across the network. And there can be occasions where there are gaps in the TTL count. We fill those in with these nodes which are listed as unknown. Basically, don't pay too much attention to them. They're just provided there so that graphically we can draw the path effectively.
Okay, thanks, JD. And we have one last question. For path alerts, is there a method to include the path in the body of the alert for post-processing?
My answer to that is probably. The ability of the event management system, or EMS, to manipulate the description of any event and incident allows for that type of change. Provided we can get whatever name it is that you want, then that could be incorporated into the details. So if you need help with that, then reach out to our support team, and they'll be able to give you some guidance.
Okay, that looks like all the questions for today, JD.
Okay, well, thank you very much. What I'd like to do is now just go back to the next slide here. So we'll talk now about an offer that we have to help you take a look at this new technology. And that is a 90-day free trial that we're offering for the new SurePath, particularly focused on the agent-based tracing. So here, if you can get your request in, that request would need to be sent through to Pat. So you see the email address there, pat.o'hara@enturity.com, and that would need to be in by the end of this month. So if you can get that request into Pat as an email by the 31st of May, she'll be able to organize you a 90-day license to be able to evaluate the agent-based path tracing for up to 20 simultaneous paths, which is beyond our standard evaluation criteria. So we're doing an extra special offer at this point. All you have to do is reach out to Pat before the end of the month with your request, and we'll get that set up for you. Okay, now we've got some helpful resources. Don't forget, if you were to go to the ENA Help Center, and if you're running ENA, you can do that simply by going to your main menu in the top left-hand corner of your screen and clicking the Help option. That'll take you through to the ENA Help Center. And if you're not at your ENA screen, you can simply go to enturity.com, select the Support tab, and in there you'll find a reference to the ENA Help Center. In there is a gold mine of information all focused on ENA, including an icon there for videos. And if you look in there, there's a whole raft of video tutorials on different aspects of the product, and all of the documentation, and the links to the recordings of all of our previous tech talks, including this one, when it gets uploaded there. So do please remember that resource is available. It's well worth consulting. And to wrap up, as I've just mentioned, the recording of today's session will be uploaded shortly to the Enturity YouTube Center, which can be accessed through that ENA Help Center as well. We are looking for suggestions as to future topics for our Tech Talks, topics that are ENA related, that are of particular interest to you, that you also feel that others would get benefit from if we were to cover them. So if you've got an idea there, please send them through. Email address is tech.talks@enturity.com, and we would be very grateful for your input on that. And so it just leaves me to wrap up with the mention that our next Tech Talk is scheduled for the June the 3rd, and the topic for that is going to be the new geographical maps. That's the Google Maps integration. We're going to cover how you can get the most from these new maps and manage your network in a more visual and meaningful way. So thank you for your time today. Please stay safe. We're here to help you maximize Enturity Network Analytics. So reach out to your Enturity account manager or Enturity support team for any questions you may have.